Every empire built on fear carries one fatal design flaw. The man at the top can never stop watching the walls. Duke Cadric Blackthorne crushed rebellions, silenced entire bloodlines, and turned his name into a word that made grown men lower their eyes. But the one thing his iron authority never prepared him for was walking into his own castle and discovering that the woman he married had already decided his power meant nothing. What happens next will test whether domination can survive the one force it was never built to contain. Stay until the very end of this story, because the last moment changes everything you thought you understood about this man. The hooves struck wet stone like hammers against coffin nails. Cadric Blackthorne rode through the outer gates of Blackthorne Keep 3 weeks ahead of schedule, his campaign cloak heavy with road dust and the particular exhaustion that comes from negotiating with men whose smiles never reach their eyes. The diplomatic summit at Heronfield had collapsed on the 4th day when Lord Pemberton tried to renegotiate grain tariffs using his daughter as currency. Cadric had ended the discussion by standing up, placing both hands flat on the table, and informing every noble present that the next man who wasted his time would find his trade routes rerouted through bandit country. He had not raised his voice. He never needed to. The courtyard of Blackthorne Keep sat empty when he dismounted. No steward rushing forward with reports. No stable hands scrambling to attention. The torches along the eastern wall burned low, and the great doors of the main hall stood half open, spilling weak amber light across flagstones that should have been swept hours ago. Cadric stood motionless beside his horse, reading the silence the way a battlefield commander reads terrain before committing troops. Something was wrong. Not the dramatic wrongness of siege or fire, something quieter, something that had settled into the stones while he was gone and made itself comfortable. Harlan. He spoke the name without turning. His captain of the guard materialized from the shadows near the gatehouse, which told Cadric everything about how long the man had been standing there, waiting. Harlan Cross had served the Blackthorne household for 19 years. He was not the kind of soldier who lingered in shadows unless the light had become dangerous. "My lord," Harlan's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man choosing each word like a surgeon choosing instruments. "We weren't expecting you until—" "I know when I was expected." Cadric pulled his riding gloves off one finger at a time, the leather creaking in the cold air. "Tell me why my castle looks like it's been holding its breath." Harlan's jaw tightened. The torchlight caught the movement, and Cadric filed it away, another piece of evidence in a trial he did not yet understand. "Perhaps you should speak with the Duchess first, my lord." "I'm speaking with you." The silence between them stretched until it became its own kind of answer. Harlan Cross was afraid, not of enemies or steel or the political maneuvering that surrounded noble houses like fog around mountain peaks. He was afraid of Cadric Blackthorne's reaction to whatever waited inside those walls. Cadric had spent his entire adult life cultivating that fear in others. He had refined it into an instrument of governance, sharpened it until it cut through deception and hesitation alike. Fear was efficient. Fear was honest in ways that loyalty rarely managed. A man who feared you told you the truth because he understood the cost of the alternative. But standing in his own courtyard, watching his most trusted soldier struggle to form a sentence, Cadric felt something shift beneath his ribs. Not quite pain, not quite recognition, but the particular unease that comes from discovering a crack in a foundation you assumed was solid. "The East Wing," Harlan finally said. "The Duchess has been keeping to the East Wing." Cadric walked through the main hall without stopping. The servants who crossed his path pressed themselves against walls, their eyes tracking him with the careful attention of prey, watching a predator navigate their territory. He catalogued each reaction: the maid who forgot to curtsy, the footman whose hands trembled around the silver tray he was carrying, the chamberlain who opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it again, as if the words had caught fire on his tongue. The East Wing corridor stretched before him, lit by candles that threw unsteady shadows across portraits of Blackthorne ancestors. His father stared down from the largest frame, that familiar expression of contempt frozen in oil paint, the eyes following anyone who dared walk beneath them. Cadric had grown up under those painted eyes, learned to sit straighter, speak less, strike harder. The old Duke had ruled Ashcombe for 31 years and never once admitted uncertainty about anything. He died in his study with a quill in his hand, still writing orders. Cedric paused at his father's portrait. He did not know why. He would wonder about that later, about the instinct that made him stop in exactly that spot, as if some buried part of his mind understood that the man he was about to become would have no use for the lessons hanging on this wall. The nursery door was closed. Light bled from beneath it. He pushed it open without knocking because Cedric Blackthorne had never knocked on a door in his own castle, and he was not about to start now. Seraphine stood beside the window with an infant cradled against her chest. The moonlight turned her dark hair silver at the edges and painted the child's face in pale blue shadow. She did not flinch when the door swung wide. She did not step back. She turned toward him the way a woman turns toward weather she has been expecting, with the steady resignation of someone who has already survived the anticipation. Cedric. Her voice was calm. Not the manufactured calm of someone performing composure, but the genuine stillness that settles into bone when a person has run out of fear and found something harder underneath. He looked at the child. The face was small, pink, wrinkled in the way all newborns are wrinkled, and unmistakable. The jawline, the particular set of the brow, the way the tiny mouth curved downward even in sleep, as if dissatisfaction was hereditary. His brother's face, Edric's face, rendered in miniature and pressed against his wife's chest like an accusation wrapped in linen. The silence in that room had weight. It settled across Cedric's shoulders and pressed down through his spine until he could feel it in the stone beneath his boots. He had commanded armies in that silence. He had sentenced men to exile and watched their families weep, and never once felt the ground shift beneath him. But this silence was different. This silence belonged to Seraphine, and she wielded it with the precision of someone who understood that the first person to speak loses control of the conversation. "How long?" His voice came out flat, stripped of everything except the mechanical function of forming words. 7 weeks. "How long have you known whose child this is?" "Since before the birth." He crossed the room in 4 strides, close enough to see the infant's eyelashes flutter against its cheeks, close enough to smell the soap and milk scent that clung to the blankets. Seraphine did not retreat. She shifted the child slightly, adjusting her hold the way mothers do, instinctive, protective, as natural as breathing, and met his eyes with an expression that contained no apology. "You brought another man's child into my house." Each word landed separately, like stones dropped into deep water. "Into my bloodline, under my roof. I brought an innocent child into the only house that could protect it. That is not your decision to make. Somebody had to make it." She held his gaze, and in that moment Cedric saw something in her eyes that he had never encountered in all his years of commanding lesser men and bending stronger ones: the absolute absence of submission, not defiance, which is just fear wearing a mask, not courage, which implies the presence of danger being overcome. Something else entirely. Something that existed independently of his power and did not require his permission to breathe. "Your brother came to me 4 months ago," Seraphine continued, her voice steady as masonry. "The mother died in childbirth, a merchant's daughter from the lower quarter. No family with enough standing to claim the child, no protection available through any legal channel. Edric was terrified. Not of you, of what the noble houses would do to an illegitimate Blackthorne heir." "There is no illegitimate Blackthorne heir." "There is now." The words hung between them like smoke after cannon fire. Cedric turned away from her, walked to the far wall, and placed his palm flat against the cold stone. The gesture was unconscious, a survival reflex buried so deep he did not recognize it as such. His body needed contact with something immovable, something that would not shift or betray or reveal the face of his brother in the middle of the night. "Where is Edric?" "Gone. He left the child and disappeared. I received 1 letter 3 weeks ago, postmarked from somewhere beyond the capital. He did not include a return address." Of course he didn't. The bitterness in Cedric's voice surprised even him. It tasted like old metal, like blood from a wound he had assumed was scarred over years ago. "Running is the one skill our father never had to teach him." He turned back to face her. The nursery suddenly felt too small, as if the walls had contracted around the 3 of them: the Duke, the Duchess, and the sleeping evidence that everything he controlled was built on assumptions that could shatter with a single birth certificate. You understand what this means. He spoke slowly, the way he spoke in council chambers when he wanted every syllable to land with judicial weight. If any noble house discovers that my wife is sheltering my brother's bastard, it will not be treated as charity. It will be treated as proof that the Blackthorne bloodline cannot manage its own affairs. Every alliance I have spent 7 years constructing will be vulnerable. Every rival who has been waiting for weakness will move. I know exactly what it means. Then why? Seraphine looked down at the child. Her expression softened in a way that Cadric had never seen directed at him. Not tenderness exactly, but recognition, the kind of look that passes between people who have survived something together. Because the alternative was a dead infant in a drainage ditch, and I decided that was too high a price for your reputation. The words hit him somewhere below rational thought, in the territory where instinct and memory and the particular cruelty of aristocratic childhood all tangled together like roots beneath old trees. He had been raised to calculate, to measure every human interaction against its political cost. His father had beaten that calculus into him with the methodical patience of a man shaping iron. Every emotional response hammered flat, every impulse toward softness identified and eliminated like rotten timber. And here stood his wife, calmly informing him that she had weighed his entire political apparatus against the life of one nameless child and found the child heavier. "You should have told me." Even as he said it, he heard the hollowness in his own voice. The argument was technically correct and completely irrelevant, and they both knew it. "Would you have said yes?" The question was a blade, and Seraphine wielded it without flinching. Cadric stared at her, and for one disorienting moment, he did not see his wife. He saw a strategist, someone who had mapped every possible response, anticipated every argument, and positioned herself exactly where his authority could not reach without destroying something essential. He left the nursery without answering. The study absorbed him the way deep water absorbs a stone, completely, without ceremony. He locked the door, poured whiskey he did not taste, and sat in the chair behind his father's desk, staring at the far wall while his mind executed the cold arithmetic of consequence. The child existed. That fact was immovable. The child carried Blackthorne blood. That fact was dangerous. Seraphine had made a decision without his authority. That fact was unprecedented. Every instinct trained into him since boyhood demanded a response proportional to the offense. His father would have sent the child away before dawn. Some distant household, some forgotten corner of the kingdom where inconvenient truths go to grow old in obscurity. The political machinery of Ashcombe was designed for exactly this kind of problem. Noble families had been erasing uncomfortable births for centuries, the practice so common it barely qualified as scandal anymore. Cadric poured a second whiskey and drank it properly this time, letting the burn trace a line from his throat to his chest. The study smelled of leather and ink and the faint cedar of old bookshelves. His father's handwriting still marked the margins of ledgers stacked along the east wall, precise, angular, emotionless as a technical drawing. He had built his entire identity on the principle that control required distance. Attachment was strategic weakness. Affection was a door you left open for enemies to walk through. Every lesson, every beating, every frozen silence at the family table had reinforced the same truth. A Blackthorne survives by becoming harder than the world around him. But sitting alone in the dark, with his brother's cowardice and his wife's courage, and an infant sleeping 2 corridors away, Cadric Blackthorne could not locate the part of himself that was supposed to make this decision feel simple. Morning arrived with the indifference of weather. Cadric emerged from his study wearing the same clothes, his eyes carrying the particular sharpness that sleep deprivation lends to men who are already dangerous. He summoned Harlan before the household had finished waking. "Who else knows about the child?" Harlan stood at attention, his face carved from the same stone as the castle walls. The attending physician, sworn to silence under penalty of losing his license and his hands. 2 nursemaids, both selected by the Duchess from her personal household, women with no connections to any noble family. The chamberlain suspects but has asked no questions. The chamberlain always suspects. Cadric's voice carried the dry precision of a man inventorying weapons. "What about outside the walls?" "Nothing confirmed, but the Duchess received visitors from the lower quarter during your absence. Merchants, traders, women carrying bundles. The gate logs show 12 entries over 6 weeks that don't match any scheduled deliveries. 12. She was thorough, my lord. Cadric almost smiled. Almost. The impulse died somewhere between recognition and the disciplined suppression of anything that might resemble admiration, because admiration meant acknowledging that Seraphine had outmaneuvered him, not through deception, but through the simple act of doing what needed to be done while he was away negotiating grain tariffs with men who measured their worth in acreage. Lord Ashworth's steward was in the market district yesterday, Harlan continued, asking questions about unusual activity at the keep. Nothing specific yet, but Ashworth's people don't ask questions without direction. Ashworth. The name tasted like copper. Roland Ashworth controlled the northern trade routes and had been circling Blackthorne influence for a decade, patient as a vulture, waiting for exactly the kind of crack that a scandal would provide. Who else is watching? The Hargrove family has increased their courier traffic. Lady Pemberton canceled her attendance at the autumn gathering, which she has never done in 11 years. And there have been 3 separate inquiries from the Royal Council about your early return from Heronfield. Cadric processed this the way his mind processed all threats. Systematically, without emotion, mapping each piece of information against the network of alliances and rivalries that constituted Ashcomb's political landscape. The picture forming was familiar. He had seen it before, in other families, at other courts. The first scent of weakness spreading through noble houses like blood in water, triggering the feeding instinct that aristocratic society had refined over centuries. The difference was that this time, the blood was his. Double the gate watch. No visitors without my personal authorization. And find me the chamberlain. The chamberlain's name was Alastair Voss, and he had served 3 generations of Blackthorns with the particular dedication of a man who understood that proximity to power was its own form of currency. He arrived in Kedric's study with his ledger under his arm and his expression carefully arranged to communicate absolute availability without revealing any personal opinion. Lord Blackthorne, how may I serve? Kedric studied him for a long moment. The pressed collar, the ink-stained fingers, the eyes that tracked the room's exits with the unconscious habit of someone who had survived decades of noble politics by always knowing where the doors were. How long have you known, Alistair? The chamberlain did not pretend to misunderstand. His shoulders shifted fractionally, the first honest movement Cadric had seen from him in years. I began to suspect 5 weeks ago, my lord. The medical supplies ordered by the Duchess exceeded standard household needs. Certain linens were requisitioned that are typically associated with infant care. The pattern was clear to anyone with access to the procurement records. And you said nothing. The Duchess did not invite my opinion, and your lordship was not present to receive a report. I chose to maintain the household's operational integrity and defer all decisions to your return. Voss paused, and something shifted behind his professional mask. Something that might have been judgment, carefully contained. I also calculated that any premature disclosure to external parties would create consequences far exceeding the boundaries of my authority. You calculated correctly. Kedric dismissed him and stood at the study window, looking down at the courtyard where servants were beginning the day's routines. The methodical labor that kept a fortress functioning, each person performing their assigned role within a system designed to concentrate power at the top. He had always found clarity in watching that machinery operate, the efficiency of hierarchy, the comfort of knowing that every action below served a purpose defined above. But today the view felt different. Today he saw the cracks, the maid who paused too long near the east wing corridor, glancing toward the nursery with an expression that mixed curiosity and fear, the stable hand who lowered his voice when speaking to the cook, both of them cutting their eyes toward Cadric's window. The gardener who stopped trimming hedges when Harlan's men crossed the courtyard, reading their body language the way animals read shifts in weather. The castle knew. Not the details, perhaps, but the shape of the secret. And secrets in noble houses behaved like water in stonework. They found every seam, every weakness, every hairline fracture, and they expanded until something gave. Kedric turned from the window and walked to the east wing. He found Seraphine in the nursery again, seated this time, the infant feeding from a bottle while morning light poured through the tall windows and turned the room golden. She looked up when he entered, and this time he saw the exhaustion she had hidden the night before, the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders carried tension like armor. "We need to discuss this properly," he said. "Sit down, then." He sat in the chair opposite her, a carved oak piece that creaked under his weight, and for a moment they simply occupied the same space. Two people who had been married for 4 years through political arrangement, who had shared a castle and a name and a public image without ever once having a conversation that mattered. "I need you to understand something," Kadrick said. "What you did was not brave, it was reckless. It placed this entire household at risk and gave every enemy I have a weapon they can use against us. I understand that. Do you also understand that I cannot simply undo it? That the child exists and every day it remains here increases the danger? The child has a name, Rowan. I don't care what—" He stopped. The name landed differently than he expected, transforming the abstraction of an inconvenient birth into something specific and individual and harder to discard. Names did that. Names turned problems into people. "Rowan," he repeated, quieter. "Edric named him before he left. It was the only decent thing he did." Kadrick leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his hands clasped in the posture of a man who has run out of standing positions. "Tell me everything. From the beginning, every detail you left out last night." Seraphine told him. She told him about Edric arriving at the servants' entrance 4 months ago, carrying a newborn wrapped in a merchant's shawl, his face the color of ash, and his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the child on the threshold. She told him about the mother, a wool trader's daughter named Ilara, 23 years old, who bled to death in a boarding house on the river road because Edric was too afraid to summon a proper physician and risk someone recognizing the Blackthorne resemblance. She told him about the weeks that followed, the careful construction of a secret nursery in the East Wing, disguised as renovation work, the recruitment of nursemaids from villages far enough from the capital that noble gossip had not yet reached them, the medical supplies smuggled in through merchant contacts she had cultivated over years of managing the Blackthorne estates. Relationships Kadrick had never bothered to notice because he classified everything below the noble houses as administrative detail. She told him about the night the infant developed a fever, and she sat alone in the nursery for 11 hours, holding a child that was not hers, watching its breathing, wondering if her husband would return to find a scandal or a funeral. "And you never considered sending word to me," Kadrick said. "Not a question, an observation. I considered it every day, and every day I decided that informing you by letter would give you the option to resolve the situation from a distance, which I knew you would take. I needed you here. I needed you to see the child, to see that it was not a political problem with a political solution." The infant made a soft sound, not quite crying, closer to the aimless vocalization of a creature still learning that its own voice exists. Seraphine adjusted the bottle with practiced ease, her attention divided between the conversation and the small life in her arms with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for weeks while her husband argued about tariffs. Kadrick watched her, and something behind his sternum shifted, a tectonic movement too deep and too slow for the surface to register immediately. He did not recognize it as the beginning of change. He would not recognize it for days, perhaps weeks, until the accumulated weight of small observations and reluctant admissions finally breached the architecture his father had spent decades constructing. For now, he simply sat in a nursery chair that was too small for him, watching his wife feed his brother's son, while the political machinery of an entire kingdom began grinding toward a confrontation that would test every alliance, every principle, and every carefully maintained wall he had ever built. "Ashworth is already asking questions," he said finally. "Hargrove is mobilizing couriers. The Royal Council wants to know why I'm back early. We have days at most before this becomes public knowledge." Seraphine looked up from the child, and for the first time Kadrick saw fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for the infant. The distinction mattered. It mattered more than he wanted to admit. "Then what do we do?" she asked. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the kingdom that bore his name. The cliffs dropped away beneath the castle walls, falling 300 feet to the ocean below, where waves broke against rock with the patient violence of centuries. The Blackthorne fortress had stood on this promontory for 11 generations, built and rebuilt and expanded by men who understood one fundamental truth. Survival belongs to those who adapt faster than the threats around them. First, Kedrick said, his voice carrying the cold precision of a man who has finished feeling and started planning, I find my brother, and when I find him, he is going to tell me every single thing he has been hiding. Not because I care about his reasons, because whatever made him desperate enough to bring a child to my wife instead of handling his own responsibilities is the same thing that is going to bring every ambitious lord in Ashcombe to my gates. He paused at the doorway. And Seraphine, yes, if Ashworth or anyone from his household contacts you directly, do not respond. Do not engage. Do not give them even the suggestion of a conversation. I have watched that man dismantle 3 noble families through nothing more than strategically timed questions and weaponized politeness. She held his gaze. And if they come to the castle? Kedrick's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. The kind of stillness that precedes decisive violence in men who have been trained to treat restraint as a tactical choice rather than a moral one. Then they will learn why the Blackthorne name has survived 11 generations, and none of the families who challenged it have survived even one. He disappeared down the corridor, his boots striking stone with the metronomic certainty of a man walking toward war. Behind him, in a nursery that smelled of milk and morning light, Seraphine pressed her lips against Rowan's forehead and whispered words that Kedrick Blackthorne would never hear. She told the child she was sorry, not for what she had done, for what was coming. 3 days later, Harlan Cross intercepted a sealed letter at the eastern gate. It bore no return address, no family crest, no signature. Inside, written in handwriting that Kedrick recognized instantly as his brother's desperate scrawl, were 9 words that turned his blood to winter. They know about the child. Trust no one inside. Kedrick read the letter 3 times. Not because the words were unclear, but because his mind needed repetitions to override the instinct that wanted to crush the paper and pretend the message had never arrived. 9 words in Edric's handwriting. 9 words that turned a domestic crisis into a siege. They know about the child. Trust no one inside. He held the paper over the candle on his desk and watched the edges curl brown, then black, then dissolve into ash that drifted across the ledgers like dirty snow. The flame ate his brother's handwriting with the indifference of all things that consume evidence, thoroughly, without opinion. When the last fragment disintegrated between his fingers, Kedrick pressed his thumb and forefinger together and felt the heat still trapped in the skin. Pain clarified. His father had taught him that before teaching him anything else. Harlan. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The captain appeared at the study door within 40 seconds, which meant he had been waiting in the corridor, which meant he had already read the fear in the messenger's face and positioned himself accordingly. Seal the east gate. Rotate the night watch to men who reported directly to me before my absence. No exceptions. And bring me the gate logs for the last 6 weeks. Every entry, every name, every cargo description. All of them. Every page. Harlan left without another question. The man understood operational urgency the way hunting dogs understand blood scent, not through analysis, but through something deeper, something bred into the nervous system over years of proximity to violence and its consequences. Kedrick stood at the window and stared down at the courtyard, tracking the movement of every figure below. The kitchen boy carrying water to the stables, the laundress hanging linens in the wind, the groundskeeper trimming the hedge along the south wall with the slow precision of a man who has performed the same task 1,000 times. Each of them a potential source. Each of them a pair of eyes and ears connected to a mouth that could carry information beyond these walls for the price of a few coins or a well-placed threat. Trust no one inside. The phrase echoed through his chest like a second heartbeat. Edric was many things, weak, selfish, spectacularly talented at choosing the worst possible moment to develop a conscience, but he was not dramatic without cause. If he wrote those words, he wrote them because he had specific knowledge, not general anxiety. Someone inside Blackthorne Keep was feeding information outward, not speculation, certainty. Kedrick's mind executed the calculation with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had spent his adult life identifying threats before they matured. The household staff numbered 47. Of those, 31 had served during his father's tenure, long enough to develop loyalties, resentments, and the particular form of institutional knowledge that made them valuable to anyone seeking intelligence about Blackthorne operations. The remaining 16 had been hired during Caedric's rule, vetted through standard protocols that suddenly felt inadequate. Any one of them, or more than one. Networks inside noble households operated like rot in timber, invisible until the structure failed. He found Seraphine in the small library adjacent to the nursery, a room she had converted into a working study during his absence. Account ledgers covered the desk. Supply manifests, correspondence with merchant contacts arranged in chronological order and cross-referenced with delivery schedules. The organizational precision startled him, not because he doubted her intelligence, but because he had never bothered to examine how she managed the operational machinery he took for granted. "We have a problem beyond the one we already have," he said, closing the door behind him. Seraphine looked up from a ledger, her quill suspended above a column of figures. The candlelight caught the ink stains on her fingers, the same fingers that held an infant with such steady certainty 3 nights ago. She read his face the way she read everything, quickly, accurately, without the comforting delay of denial. "The letter. You know about it." Harlan's expression when he brought it to you was visible from the nursery window. "I know what fear looks like on a soldier's face. What did Edric say?" He told her. Not the exact words. Those belonged to Ash now. But the substance. Someone inside the castle. Information flowing outward. The walls they trusted becoming the architecture of their exposure. Seraphine set down her quill with deliberate care, aligning it parallel to the ledger's edge. The gesture was small, controlled, and Caedric recognized it as the same kind of physical self-management he practiced, the channeling of internal turbulence into precise external action. "The nursemaids," she said. "I chose them myself. Women from Ashford and Maren, villages where my family name still carries weight. They have no connections to any noble house and no reason to betray a confidence that would cost them their positions and their safety. Everyone has a reason at the right price. Not everyone. That is something you have never been willing to believe, and it has cost you more than you realize." The rebuke landed cleanly. Caedric felt it the way you feel a paper cut, sharp, immediate, disproportionately irritating relative to its size. He wanted to argue. He wanted to inform her that idealism was a luxury purchased with other people's vigilance. But the letter burning in his memory made the argument feel less like conviction and more like reflex. "The chamberlain," he said instead. "Voss has access to every procurement record, every delivery manifest, every household account. If someone inside this castle identified the pattern of supplies you ordered for the nursery, Voss is the most likely source. Alistair Voss has served this family for 30 years, which means he has survived 3 generations of Blackthorns. Think about what kind of man does that. Not a loyal one, an adaptable one. And adaptable men serve whoever represents the best odds of continued survival." Seraphine's eyes narrowed, not in anger, in recognition. She was testing his logic against her own observations, measuring his suspicion against the man she had worked alongside for months. The process was visible on her face, each conclusion arriving and being weighed before the next. "There is another possibility," she said quietly. "Tell me." "Your brother's letter assumes the information leaked from inside, but Edric himself was the original breach. He carried the child through the streets. He traveled from wherever the mother died to this castle, carrying an infant whose face looks exactly like his. Every inn, every toll road, every bridge crossing, he left a trail. The leak may not be inside these walls at all. It may have followed him here." The logic was clean. Caedric hated it because it was clean and because he had not seen it first. His mind had jumped to internal betrayal because internal betrayal was the threat his training prepared him for. The enemy within, the trusted advisor turned weapon. But Seraphine was right. Edric's panicked journey from the river road to the servants' entrance was itself a breach, a line of evidence stretching across miles of territory visible to anyone paying attention. "Both," Caedric said. "We assume both until we can eliminate one." He summoned Harlan again. The gate logs arrived within the hour. a stack of leather-bound registers documenting every person, vehicle, and cargo that had entered or exited Blackthorne Keep for the past 6 weeks. Kedrick spread them across his desk and began the tedious archaeology of Reconstruction, cross-referencing names against the household roster, comparing delivery schedules with Seraphine's procurement records, building a timeline that would reveal either consistency or gaps. Seraphine worked beside him. They did not discuss this arrangement. She simply pulled a chair to the opposite side of the desk, took half the registers, and began her own analysis with the systematic focus of someone accustomed to finding meaning in columns of numbers. They worked in silence for 3 hours, the only sounds the scratch of quills marking discrepancies and the occasional crack of a log shifting in the fireplace. It was the most intimate thing they had ever done. Kedrick noticed this and immediately buried the observation beneath operational focus. But the awareness persisted, a low signal beneath the noise of crisis, registering the unprecedented fact of his wife sitting across from him as a working partner rather than a political accessory. 4 years of marriage, and this was the first time they had occupied the same room with a shared purpose that did not involve public performance. The discrepancy emerged at 11 in the evening. Here, Seraphine placed her finger on an entry dated 3 weeks prior. A delivery of candle wax from Harding & Sons, 40 pounds, standard household supply. But the delivery was received by a name I don't recognize, Marcus Hale. There is no Marcus Hale on the household roster. Kedrick checked the roster twice. She was correct. No Marcus Hale had been employed at Blackthorne Keep at any point during the last decade. The name was a ghost, someone who had entered the castle, signed for a delivery, and vanished from the official record. "Harlan!" Kedrick called into the corridor. The captain materialized again, his face showing the particular strain of a man who has been maintaining alertness for too long without rest. "Marcus Hale. Find out who used that name at the East Gate 3 weeks ago. Check the delivery driver from Harding & Sons. I want a physical description, height, build, distinguishing features, and I want it before dawn." "My lord, the Harding route runs through Ashworth territory." The sentence detonated in the quiet study like a grenade buried under snow. Ashworth territory. The candle wax delivery, a routine supply order so mundane it would pass through any gate inspection without a second glance, had originated from a supplier whose trade route ran directly through the domain of Lord Roland Ashworth. The man who had spent a decade circling Blackthorne influence. The man whose steward was already asking questions in the market district. Kedrick's hands went still on the desk. The world compressed to a single point of clarity. The kind of focus that precedes either violence or a decision so fundamental it reshapes everything downstream. "He is already inside," Kedrick said. Not a question. A recognition. Seraphine looked at him across the desk, her face stripped of everything except the raw intelligence that had been running this household while he negotiated trade agreements with men who smiled too much. She understood. Ashworth had not simply been watching from a distance. He had planted someone inside the castle, someone operating under a false name, with access to the gate, capable of observing the unusual activity in the East Wing and reporting back through commercial channels that would never appear suspicious. "How long?" Her voice held the controlled precision of a woman calculating odds. "Long enough?" If the candle wax delivery was 3 weeks ago, and Ashworth's steward started asking questions in the market district this week, the intelligence has already been processed. Ashworth knows. He knows about the child, he knows its parentage, and he is currently deciding how to use that information for maximum damage. What does maximum damage look like? Kedrick leaned back in his chair. The wood groaned. A formal inquiry before the Great Council, a demand for investigation into the Blackthorne bloodline, accusations of concealment, deception, and violation of noble succession laws. Every house that owes me a debt will be given the opportunity to repay it by siding against me instead. And Ashworth will present himself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of aristocratic tradition, the concerned peer who discovered corruption and felt obligated to bring it to light. He will make himself the hero. He will make us the scandal. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the study in shades of red and amber that made the shadows deeper and the silence heavier. Somewhere in the East Wing, Rowan slept with the uncomplicated peace of an infant who did not yet understand that his existence had become a weapon in a war he never chose. "There is one move Ashworth cannot anticipate," Seraphine said. Cadric waited. He had learned something in the last 3 days that his father's training never covered. That silence between two people working toward the same objective is not weakness. It is the space where the better idea arrives. He expects you to hide the child. Every calculation he is making, every alliance, every argument, every piece of evidence he is assembling, depends on the assumption that you will try to bury this, deny it, send Rowan away, destroy the evidence, and rely on Blackthorne power to suppress the story, because that is what every duke before you would have done. And if I don't, then every weapon he has prepared becomes useless. You cannot expose a man for hiding something he has already revealed himself. Cadric stared at her. The idea was insane. It was also, in the ruthless arithmetic of political survival, the only move on the board that did not lead to a defensive war he could not win. Ashworth had built his strategy on concealment, on the certainty that Blackthorne would follow the established pattern of aristocratic damage control. Every noble family in history had responded to scandal the same way: deny, suppress, eliminate. The playbook was so consistent it might as well have been carved into the walls of every council chamber in the kingdom, and Seraphine was suggesting he throw the playbook into the fire. "Claiming the child publicly," he said slowly, testing each word against the consequences it would generate. "Legal recognition, Blackthorne protection. Full acknowledgement, not as a secret to be managed, as a decision to be defended. The council will demand justification. The council can demand whatever it wants. You are the Duke of Blackthorne. Your authority over your own household is absolute. Any challenge to that authority is not a question about the child. It is a question about whether the nobility has the right to dictate terms to a sitting duke. And that is a fight every other duke in the kingdom has a personal interest in seeing you win." The strategy was elegant in its brutality. By reframing the issue from scandal to sovereignty, Seraphine had identified the one fault line that would split Ashworth's coalition before it formed. Every duke, every lord, every noble who held authority over their own lands would understand the precedent at stake. If the council could override Blackthorne's household decisions today, it could override theirs tomorrow. Self-interest, the most reliable force in aristocratic politics, would do the work that loyalty never could. Cadric stood. He crossed the room and stopped beside the window, his reflection ghosting across the dark glass. The man staring back at him looked older than he remembered, harder around the eyes, the jaw set in the particular configuration of someone who has just been presented with a door that only opens one way. "If I do this," he said, "there is no reversal, no retreat. The moment I make that declaration, every alliance I hold will be tested, every enemy will mobilize. And if we are wrong about the political calculation, if the other houses decide that tradition outweighs sovereignty, then Blackthorne falls. Blackthorne falls if you do nothing. Ashworth will make sure of it. The only question is whether you fall defending something that matters or fall running from something you could not control." He turned from the window. Their eyes met across the darkened study, across the scattered gate logs and the dying fire, and the distance that 4 years of political marriage had constructed between them. And in that look, something cracked. Not the dramatic shattering of revelation, but the quiet fracture of a wall that had been weakening from the inside for days, stressed by the accumulating weight of evidence that the woman he married was not the decorative alliance he had been trained to expect. She was the only strategist in the room whose judgment he trusted. "I need to find Edric first," Cadric said. "Before I make any public declaration, I need his full testimony." Every detail of the child's birth, every person who knew, every contact he made during and after. Ashworth will attack the narrative. I need to own every piece of it before he can. "Then go. I will hold the castle." The words landed with a weight that neither of them acknowledged aloud. "I will hold the castle." The statement of a partner assuming command in the absence of the other, not asking permission, not requesting authority, but stepping into the role because the situation demanded it, and she was the one standing in the right position. Cadric nodded once. He walked to the door, paused, and spoke without turning back. "The nursemaids stay. Voss is confined to the administrative wing until I return. Full access to records, no access to the East Wing or external communications. And Harlan answers to you. Harlan answers to you. Not while I'm gone. I need someone running this castle who sees threats I would miss. That person is not Harlan. It is you. He left before she could respond, because Cedric Blackthorne had never been comfortable with moments that required him to acknowledge the limitations of his own perspective, and admitting that his wife's judgment exceeded his own in certain critical dimensions was already more vulnerability than he had shown anyone in a decade. He rode out before dawn with 4 men, soldiers selected not for rank, but for the specific quality of incuriosity that made them reliable under conditions where asking questions was dangerous. The road east stretched through forest and farmland, past villages that flew Blackthorne banners from their gates and market towns where his name was spoken in the careful tones reserved for forces of nature. Edric's last known location was beyond the capital, somewhere in the scattered territory where disgraced nobles and failed merchants went to become invisible. Finding him would require methods that did not appear in any manual of aristocratic diplomacy. It would require the skills Cedric had learned not from his father's study, but from the campaigns, the interrogation techniques, the informant networks, the particular talent for applying pressure to exactly the point where resistance becomes more painful than cooperation. He did not look back at the castle as he rode. He did not need to. He could feel it behind him. The weight of stone and blood and the small, sleeping life that had cracked the architecture of everything he believed about power. The walls would hold. Seraphine would hold them. But beyond those walls, in the council chambers and manor houses and private studies where ambitious men plotted their advancement, something was already moving. Ashworth had the information. The conspiracy was forming. And somewhere ahead on this road, his brother carried the rest of the truth. The pieces Cedric needed to assemble before the entire structure collapsed. 60 miles east, in a room above a farrier's shop in a town whose name appeared on no official map, Cedric Blackthorne sat at a table covered with documents he had stolen from the private archive of Lord Roland Ashworth's estate. Documents that proved the conspiracy was not about one child at all. It was about replacing the Duke of Blackthorne entirely. And the architect of that replacement was not Ashworth. It was someone Cedric had trusted for 30 years. The room above the farrier's shop smelled of horse sweat and iron filings, and the particular desperation that clings to men who have been sleeping in their clothes for weeks. Cedric Blackthorne sat behind a table covered with stolen documents, and when the door opened without warning, he did not reach for a weapon or bolt for the window. He simply looked up at his older brother with the exhausted resignation of a man who had been waiting for this moment the way condemned men wait for sentencing, not with hope, but with the grim relief that the uncertainty was finally over. Cedric filled the doorway. Behind him, 4 soldiers occupied the narrow staircase with the quiet efficiency of men who understood that their function was presence, not participation. The brothers had not been in the same room for 19 months. The last occasion had been a formal dinner at Blackthorne Keep, where Edric drank too much wine and Cedric pretended not to notice, both of them performing the particular theater of sibling tolerance that noble families perfected across generations. That theater was finished now. "Sit down, Cedric." "I'll stand." Edric nodded, as if he had expected exactly that response and had already moved past it. His face had changed since Cedric last saw him. Thinner, the bones more prominent, the eyes carrying a new quality that looked less like fear and more like the aftermath of fear, the hollow space left behind when terror has burned through a man completely and left only the carbon residue of hard knowledge. "You found the documents," Cedric said, looking at the papers spread across the table. Not a question. "I stole them from Ashworth's secondary estate at Thornfield. He keeps his real correspondence there. Not the official letters that pass through couriers and get archived in the council registry, but the private exchanges, the ones written in his own hand and sealed with wax that doesn't match any noble house." Cedric stepped into the room and closed the door. The latch clicked with a sound that sealed both of them inside the consequences of whatever truth these documents contained. He looked at the papers without touching them. Years of interrogation training had taught him that the way evidence is arranged reveals as much about the person who assembled it as the information itself. Edric had organized the documents chronologically, dates visible, connections marked with small ink notations in the margins, the work of a man who had spent weeks alone with these pages, reading and rereading until the pattern emerged from the noise like bones surfacing from eroded soil. "Start talking," Kedrick said. Edric leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped in a posture that Kedrick recognized from their childhood. The way Edric used to sit when confessing some transgression to their father, shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. "Ashworth has been planning your removal for 3 years. Not a challenge before the council. Not a political maneuver. An actual structural replacement. Installing a new Duke of Blackthorne through a combination of manufactured scandal, forged succession claims, and strategic alliances with houses that owe him debts they can never repay publicly. 3 years. At minimum. These letters go back that far. There may be more I didn't find." Kedrick absorbed this the way his body absorbed blows during sparring, acknowledging the impact without surrendering balance. 3 years. While he had been consolidating trade agreements, fortifying borders, and managing the daily machinery of governance, someone had been quietly constructing the scaffolding for his destruction. The efficiency of it registered before the emotional weight. A well-planned coup required patience, resources, and access. Ashworth had the first two. The third required something else. Who is feeding him information from inside the keep? Edric's hands tightened against each other. The knuckles went white, then slowly released. The gesture was answer enough, but Kedrick needed to hear it spoken. He needed the name delivered in human breath, not inferred from paper. "Say it." Alistair Voss. The name landed in the small room like a stone dropped into still water. Kedrick felt the ripples spread through his chest. Not the sharp pain of surprise, but the deep structural ache of confirmation. Some part of him had already known. The calculation he had made in the study 3 days ago, adaptable men serve whoever represents the best odds, had been closer to the truth than even he realized. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it confirmed are separated by a distance that no amount of preparation can eliminate. 30 years. Voss had served the Blackthorne household for 30 years. He had managed the accounts during Kedrick's father's illness, maintained the estate during the succession transition, stood at Kedrick's side during 3 separate political crises with the unshakable composure of a man whose loyalty was structural rather than emotional. Kedrick had trusted him not because Voss inspired affection, but because Voss inspired something more valuable. The confidence that comes from consistent, predictable, reliable service. And all of it had been architecture. A 30-year investment in proximity, building access and trust with the patient methodology of a man who understood that the most dangerous position in any fortress is the one closest to the ruler. "How?" Kedrick's voice came out flat, controlled, stripped to mechanical function. The single word was enough. Voss has been providing Ashworth with financial records, military deployment schedules, and household intelligence for at least 5 years. The arrangement predates your marriage to Seraphine. These letters reference specific council sessions, decisions you made in private, arguments you had with advisors behind closed doors, strategic positions you considered and rejected. The level of detail is impossible without someone present in the room. Voss is never present in council sessions. He doesn't need to be. He manages the records afterward. Every document that passes through your study passes through his hands for filing and archival. Every letter you receive, every correspondence you send, Voss processes the administrative record. He has been copying relevant materials and delivering them through Ashworth's commercial network. The candle wax deliveries from Harding and Sons. That was the channel. The candle wax. The ghost name in the gate log, Marcus Hale. A delivery so mundane it was invisible, passing through the castle gates with the regularity of seasons, carrying intelligence embedded in the routine commerce of a functioning household. Kedrick had spent 3 days searching for a leak when the leak had been built into the plumbing from the beginning. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below. The farrier's shop occupied a corner lot in a town that existed primarily as a waypoint between larger destinations, the kind of place where people stopped but did not stay, where faces changed weekly and nobody paid attention to strangers because strangers were the primary population. Edric had chosen well. For all his weaknesses, the younger Blackthorne understood concealment the way prey understands terrain. Why did you run? Kedrick asked the question without turning from the window. When you brought the child to Seraphine, you could have told her about Voss. You could have warned us. I didn't know about Voss when I brought Rowan to the keep. I learned about the conspiracy afterward, when I was already running. I went to Ashworth's estate because I was desperate and stupid and looking for leverage, something I could use to protect my son if everything collapsed. What I found was worse than anything I imagined. So you sent a 9-word letter and kept running. I sent the letter because I couldn't trust a longer message. Every courier route in the eastern provinces passes through territory where Ashworth has influence. A sealed letter with no details was the only communication that had a chance of reaching you without being intercepted and decoded. And I kept the documents because they are the only proof that exists. If Ashworth discovers they are missing, he will accelerate his timeline, and every plan he has made will execute before you have the chance to counter it. Kedrick turned from the window. He studied his brother. The unwashed clothes, the hollow cheeks, the way Edric's eyes tracked the room's exits with the unconscious reflex of a man who had been hunted. Whatever contempt Kedrick carried for his brother's original cowardice, abandoning a pregnant woman, fleeing from his own child, the man sitting at this table had done something afterward that required a different kind of courage. Stealing documents from a lord's private estate was not running. It was the desperate, reckless act of someone trying to repair damage they caused, knowing the repair might cost them everything. The succession claim, Kedrick said. Ashworth needs a legal basis for replacement. What is it? Edric pulled a specific document from the center of the table. A letter written on heavy cream paper in handwriting that was precise, angular, and familiar in a way that made Kedrick's vision narrow to a point. Read the 3rd paragraph. Kedrick read it, then read it again. The words assembled themselves into meaning with the slow, grinding inevitability of a machine designed to produce a single, devastating output. The letter outlined a legal challenge to Kedrick's succession based on a technicality buried in Ashcombe's inheritance laws, a provision requiring the reigning duke to produce a legitimate heir within a specified period or face potential review by the Great Council. The provision had not been invoked in over a century. It was considered obsolete, an artifact of an era when bloodline continuity was the primary mechanism of political stability. But it had never been formally repealed. It existed in the legal framework like a loaded weapon forgotten in a drawer, harmless until someone remembered where to find it. Ashworth had remembered, and the letter proposing this legal challenge was not written by Ashworth. It was written by Alistair Voss. The handwriting was unmistakable. Kedrick had seen it on thousands of documents. Ledger entries, supply requisitions, household correspondence, the daily administrative record of a castle managed with meticulous efficiency by a man whose penmanship was as precise as his betrayal. Voss had not simply been feeding information to Ashworth. He had been architecting the legal strategy for Kedrick's removal. The chamberlain was not a spy. He was the engineer. Kedrick set the letter down on the table. His hand was steady. His breathing was controlled. Every external indicator suggested a man in complete command of his response. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. A tectonic realignment of assumptions so fundamental that the ground itself felt unreliable. He had built his understanding of loyalty on the premise that reliability equaled devotion, that a man who served consistently served faithfully, that the machinery of trust could be maintained through the same systematic oversight he applied to everything else in his domain. That premise was burning in front of him, and the smoke smelled like 30 years of certainty turning to ash. "There's more," Edric said. His voice carried the particular heaviness of a man who has already delivered bad news and knows the worst is still coming. The documents reference a secondary operation, something Ashworth calls the Thornfield Protocol in 3 separate letters. The details are vague, deliberately so, but the timing references align with your diplomatic schedule, specifically the summit at Herrenfield. The summit I cut short. Yes, you were supposed to be gone for 3 more weeks. The Thornfield Protocol was scheduled to execute during your absence. You returning early disrupted the timeline, but it did not cancel the operation. It delayed it. What is the operation? Edric's jaw tightened. He looked at the documents, then at his brother, then at his own hands. I don't know the specifics, but 2 things are clear from the correspondence. First, The protocol requires Voss to be inside the keep with operational access. Second, it involves the child. The words hit Kadrick's bloodstream like venom, not the dramatic, immediate kind that stops the heart, but the slower variety that works through the system methodically, paralyzing function after function until the body realizes too late that it has been shutting down for hours. Rowan. The protocol involved Rowan. He did not know when the child had stopped being an abstraction and started being a name that triggered protective instinct. The transition had happened somewhere between the nursery and this filthy room above a farrier's shop, somewhere in the accumulation of small moments. Watching Seraphine adjust a bottle with steady hands, seeing the infant's face carry his brother's features like an echo of shared blood, hearing her say the alternative was a dead infant in a drainage ditch. Each moment had deposited a thin layer of something he did not have a word for, and the layers had accumulated until they formed a surface strong enough to stand on. Now someone was threatening to break it. I confined Voss to the administrative wing before I left, Kadrick said, his mind already racing through operational scenarios with the accelerating urgency of a man recalculating every variable in a collapsing equation. He has no access to the East Wing. Administrative confinement means nothing to a man who has spent 30 years learning every corridor, every passage, every servant rotation in that castle. Voss knows Blackthorne Keep better than you do. He built the filing system. He designed the supply chain protocols. He knows which doors lock from the inside and which ones don't, which guards take their meals at what hour, which sections of the East Wing are unmonitored during the night watch transition. The truth of this settled into Kadrick's bones with the cold weight of iron. He had confined a man to a section of his own castle and believed that paper authority would contain someone whose real power was not positional but structural, embedded in the architecture of daily operations the way mortar is embedded between stones. Removing Voss from his title meant nothing. His knowledge was the weapon, and that weapon was still inside the walls where Seraphine and Rowan slept. "How long ago did you send the letter?" Kadrick demanded. 6 days. 6 days. He calculated distances, travel times, the speed of information moving through Ashworth's network. If Ashworth knew the documents were missing, and a man that methodical would have systems to detect theft, then the timeline was already accelerating. The Thornfield Protocol, whatever it contained, would be moved forward. Not weeks, days, possibly hours. Seraphine was alone in that castle with a man who had spent 3 decades building the machinery of his betrayal into the walls around her. "Get up," Kadrick said. "Kadrick, get up. Bring every document. We ride now." If we ride straight to the keep, Ashworth will know. His scouts monitor the eastern roads. 4 soldiers and 2 Blackthorns riding at speed toward the castle will signal that the operation is compromised, and he will activate whatever contingency. I am not leaving my wife and that child in a castle with the man who is planning to destroy everything I hold. The sentence came out raw, unfiltered, stripped of every layer of strategic calculation that normally stood between Kadrick's impulses and his words. He heard it after he spoke it and recognized something in his own voice that he had never heard before. Not the cold precision of command, not the controlled authority of a duke issuing orders, but the ragged, fundamental sound of a man who has discovered that the things he is willing to fight for have changed. My wife and that child. Not my household. Not my political position. Not my legacy or my authority or the Blackthorne name. My wife. That child. The shift was seismic. Everything he had been trained to prioritize, the strategic calculus, the institutional preservation, the systematic subordination of personal attachment to political necessity, all of it had been reorganizing beneath his awareness for days. And this moment was simply the point where the new architecture broke through the surface. He was not the same man who rode into Blackthorne Keep 3 weeks ago and found a baby in his nursery. That man would have calculated the optimal response, measured the political cost, and executed the decision that best served the duchy's long-term stability. That man operated on principles his father had installed like load-bearing walls, rigid, weight-distributing, designed to prevent exactly the kind of structural failure that comes from caring too much about any single thing. Those walls were down, and what stood in their place was something older and more dangerous than political calculation, the raw, unarmored conviction that some things are not negotiable. Not because they serve strategic purposes, because they are the whole point. Edric saw the change. It registered on his face as something between recognition and grief. The look of a man watching his brother become someone new and understanding that the transformation was irreversible. "There's a route through the Harrow Valley," Edric said quietly. "Shepherd's trails. Too narrow for carriages, invisible from the main roads. It adds 4 hours but bypasses every checkpoint Ashworth maintains. Then we take it. And when we arrive?" Cadric gathered the documents from the table, his movements precise, deliberate, each page handled with the care of a man who understands that paper can be more lethal than steel when placed in the right hands at the right moment. "When we arrive, Alistair Voss is going to learn what 30 years of trust costs when the invoice comes due." They rode through the night. The shepherd's trails wound through the Harrow Valley like veins through dark tissue, narrow and uneven, bordered by rock walls that channeled the wind into a constant low moan. The horses picked their way through terrain that punished speed, forcing patience on a man whose every instinct screamed urgency. Edric rode in silence, his mind executing parallel tracks of planning and reassessment with the desperate focus of a man rebuilding a map, while the ground shifts beneath him. Every assumption he had carried for the past decade was contaminated. Every decision he had made with Voss in the room, every strategy discussed, every vulnerability admitted, every moment of what he believed was private deliberation, had been observed, recorded, and transmitted to the man building his destruction. The scope of it was staggering, not just the betrayal itself, but its duration, its patience, its absolute discipline. Voss had maintained his performance for 30 years without a single moment of detectable inconsistency. No suspicious behavior, no unexplained absences, no financial irregularities that would trigger an audit. The man had constructed a second identity, the loyal chamberlain, and worn it so completely that the mask had become indistinguishable from the face beneath it. And Cadric had never questioned it, because questioning Voss would have meant questioning the system itself, the architecture of trust that allowed a duke to govern without watching every shadow. His father had trusted Voss, his father who trusted nothing and no one, who taught his sons that suspicion was the price of survival, had looked at Alistair Voss and seen reliability. Even the master of suspicion had been outplayed. And the lesson buried in that fact was the kind that changed a man's understanding of power at the molecular level. Control was not possession. Authority was not security. The walls a man built to protect himself could be turned into the walls of his prison by anyone patient enough to learn where the doors were hidden. Dawn found them descending the western edge of the valley, the castle visible in the distance, a dark mass against the paling sky, perched on its cliff above the ocean, like a creature surveying territory it considered its own. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys. The banners hung limp in the still morning air. From this distance, everything looked normal. Cadric's hands tightened on the reins. Beside him, Edric rode with the documents wrapped in oilcloth and strapped to his saddle, his face carrying the gray exhaustion of a man who has not slept in 36 hours and knows that rest is still far away. The 4 soldiers maintained formation behind them, silent, professional, asking nothing. 3 miles from the outer gates, Harlan Cross met them on the road. The captain was on foot, which was wrong. Harlan did not leave the castle perimeter without authorization, and he did not travel on foot when horses were available. His armor was disarranged, the left shoulder guard unfastened, the sword belt shifted to an improvised position that suggested rapid arming. There was blood on his right hand. Not much. Enough. Cadric dismounted before his horse fully stopped. "Report." Harlan's face held the expression of a man delivering information he knows will detonate. Voss moved 2 hours before dawn. He accessed the east wing through the service corridor beneath the kitchens, a passage not included on any current security map because it was sealed during your father's renovation 20 years ago. He unsealed it. The masonry had been loosened in advance, weeks in advance, my lord. The mortar was already crumbling when we found it. "Seraphine." "The Duchess is secure. She barricaded the nursery door when she heard movement in the corridor. By the time my men reached the east wing, Voss had retreated through the same passage." Harlan paused. The pause carried weight. "He did not leave the castle. He is still inside the walls, and he is not alone." "How many?" "We have identified 3 household staff members who failed to report for morning duties. Their quarters are empty, personal effects removed. They were part of his network, positioned over months, possibly years, waiting for activation. 4 people. Inside his castle, operating under his authority, eating his food, sleeping under his roof, while systematically preparing to dismantle everything from within. Cedric looked at the castle on the cliff, the fortress his family had held for 11 generations, the stone walls that had survived sieges, storms, and centuries of political warfare. And now the greatest threat it had ever faced was not approaching from outside. It was already inside. It had always been inside. "Seal every exit," Cedric said, and his voice carried something new. Not the cold authority of the Iron Duke, and not the calculated precision of a political strategist, but the raw, irreducible hardness of a man who has lost the luxury of choosing between who he was and who he needs to become. No one leaves. No one enters. And Harlan, when we find Voss, he answers to me, not to the council, not to the law, to me. He mounted his horse and rode toward the gates of a castle that was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. And Cedric Blackthorne was riding into it with his eyes open because the woman and the child inside those walls mattered more than the walls themselves, and that single, irreversible truth had already made him into someone his father would not recognize, someone who might actually survive this. The gates of Blackthorne Keep swallowed Cedric whole. He rode through the outer courtyard at a pace that scattered servants and sent stable hands pressing against walls. Edric followed 3 lengths behind, the oilcloth bundle of stolen documents clutched against his chest like a man carrying his own organs outside his body. The 4 soldiers fanned into defensive positions without orders, muscle memory taking over where verbal command became unnecessary. Cedric dismounted and handed the reins to no one. The horse stood where it was left, trained well enough to recognize when its rider had already moved beyond the reach of routine. He crossed the courtyard in 12 strides, boots striking stone with a rhythm that every person within earshot recognized as the cadence of a man who had stopped negotiating with circumstances and started dictating to them. Harlan fell in beside him at the main doors. "East wing is secured. The Duchess and the child are in the upper nursery with 2 of my men. The service corridor Voss used has been collapsed. We dropped a section of ceiling into it. Nobody is coming through that passage again." "Where is he?" "The lower keep, the grain storage levels. My scouts have confirmed movement on the 3rd sub-level. At least 2 people, possibly 3. Voss knows those spaces. During the renovation under your father, he personally oversaw the inventory redistribution. There are connecting passages between the storage chambers that don't appear on any architectural plan I have seen. Because they were never mapped, my father ordered the lower keep sealed after the renovation. Voss was the only person who maintained access for inventory management." Cedric heard his own words and tasted the bitter arithmetic of trust exploited. Every convenience he had granted the chamberlain, every access point left unquestioned because questioning Voss meant questioning 30 years of assumed loyalty, had become another corridor his enemies could move through unseen. He stopped at the base of the east wing staircase. "I need to see Seraphine first." "My lord, Voss is cornered. If we delay—" "I said first." Harlan stepped aside. Cedric took the stairs 2 at a time, his body running on something beyond adrenaline, a fuel source that operated in the space between desperation and absolute clarity, burning through fatigue the way wildfire burns through drought-dry timber. The upper nursery door was barricaded from inside with a heavy oak dresser that Seraphine had apparently moved by herself. He heard it scrape across stone when she pulled it back after Harlan's men confirmed his identity through the door. She opened it herself. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders in a way he had never seen outside their private chambers. A kitchen knife was in her left hand, the heavy chopping blade from the main kitchen, 8 inches of carbon steel that she held with the grip of someone who had already decided she would use it. Behind her, Rowan slept in the crib. The infant's face was peaceful, unaware, carrying Edric's features in the soft, unfinished way that newborns carry heredity. A suggestion rather than a statement, a rough draft of the person the child might become. "Are you hurt?" Cedric said. "No." Seraphine set the knife on the windowsill. The gesture was deliberate, placing the weapon within reach, not surrendering it. "He came through the wall, Cedric. The plaster cracked at 3 in the morning, and a panel moved inward. If I had been sleeping in the main bedroom instead of here with Rowan, he would have had access to the nursery for minutes before anyone responded. You heard him. I heard the mortar. I have been sleeping lightly since you left. She paused. The candlelight caught something in her eyes that was not tears and not fear, but the cold, polished surface of a woman who had spent 3 days alone in a castle she no longer trusted, protecting a child that was not hers, armed with a kitchen knife, and the certainty that nobody was coming to help until it was possibly too late. He was not coming for me. He was coming for Rowan. The words confirmed what Cedric already knew from Edric's intelligence, but hearing them from Seraphine, hearing the specificity of the threat articulated by the woman who had physically positioned herself between an infant and a hidden passage, drove the reality through every remaining layer of detachment he possessed. Voss had come for the child, not to harm Seraphine, not to steal documents or sabotage infrastructure, but to remove the one piece of evidence that made the Blackthorne scandal tangible. Without the child, there was no proof. Without proof, there was no scandal. And without scandal, the legal challenge Voss had engineered, the obscure succession provision, the council review, the manufactured crisis, would lose its foundation. The child was not collateral. The child was the target. Cedric stepped forward and placed his hand on Seraphine's shoulder. The contact was brief, deliberate, and loaded with more meaning than either of them had the time or the language to unpack. She looked up at him, and in that look passed the kind of understanding that does not require words. The mutual recognition of two people who have been pushed past the boundaries of their arrangement and into territory where the old definitions no longer apply. Edric is here, Cedric said. He has documents proving Ashworth's conspiracy. Voss is the architect. I'm going down to the lower keep to end this. End it how? I haven't decided yet. That is the first honest thing you have said to me since we married. He almost laughed. The impulse surprised him. Not its existence, but its timing, surfacing in the middle of a crisis like a green shoot pushing through cracked pavement, evidence of life in conditions that should not support it. He did not laugh. But the impulse registered, and he filed it in the growing catalog of responses that the old Cedric would have suppressed, and the new one was learning to acknowledge. Stay here. Harlan's men hold this corridor. Nobody enters without my voice confirming the order. Not Harlan's voice, mine. And if your voice doesn't come? Cedric looked at the kitchen knife on the windowsill, then at the woman who had moved a dresser across a stone floor by herself at 3 a.m. to protect a child she had no obligation to protect. Then you do what you have been doing since this started. You hold. He descended into the lower keep. The grain storage levels occupied the basement of Blackthorne Keep, a network of stone chambers carved into the cliff face during the fortress's original construction, expanded and modified over generations until the layout resembled a nervous system more than an architectural plan. The air thickened with each level, collecting moisture and cold, and the heavy mineral smell of rock that has never seen sunlight. Torch sconces lined the walls at irregular intervals, casting pools of amber light separated by stretches of darkness deep enough to hide a man. Cedric moved through the first sublevel with 4 soldiers, and Harlan at his back. The formation was tight, close enough for mutual protection, spread enough to cover angles. Each doorway was a potential ambush point. Each corridor intersection demanded a pause, a visual clear, a confirmation before proceeding. The process was slow, methodical, and excruciating for a man whose instinct demanded speed. But instinct was not what would keep him alive in these corridors. Discipline would. The difference between men who survived underground combat and men who died in it was rarely courage. It was patience, the willingness to move at the speed of certainty rather than the speed of fear. They found the first of Voss's people on the second sublevel. A young man, early 20s, one of the household staff who had failed to report for morning duties, was crouched behind a stack of grain barrels near the connecting passage to the 3rd level. He was armed with a short sword that he held the way civilians hold weapons they have never used, too tight, too high, the blade trembling with the particular vibration that separates men who have trained for violence from men who have merely imagined it. Put it down, Harlan said. The command was quiet, professional, delivered with the absolute assurance of a man who had disarmed better fighters in worse conditions. The young man's eyes were wide. They tracked between the soldiers, calculating odds that his body had already computed. 5 armed men, professional formation, against a household servant with a weapon he did not know how to use. The math was not complicated. He said, Voss said there would be... The words came out fractured, panicked, the verbal equivalent of a man losing his footing on ice. He said Lord Ashworth would protect anyone who... Ashworth is not here, Kedrick said. He stepped forward, past Harlan, close enough to see the sweat beading along the young man's hairline. I am. Put the sword down and tell me exactly where Voss is. You have one chance to be useful to me. That chance expires the moment my patience does. The sword clattered to the stone floor. The sound echoed through the corridors like a bone breaking. Voss was on the 3rd sublevel. The servant gave up the location with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that his survival depended entirely on the speed of his cooperation. The deepest chamber, the one that backed against the cliff face itself, where a natural fissure in the rock had been widened during construction to serve as an emergency ventilation shaft. Voss had 2 remaining people with him and access to a passage that theoretically led to the cliff face, an exit that had been sealed decades ago, but that Voss, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the castle's hidden anatomy, might have prepared in advance. Kedrick descended to the 3rd sublevel alone. Harlan objected. The soldiers objected. The operational logic was clear. Sending the Duke unaccompanied into a confined space with a cornered enemy was tactically indefensible. Every principle of security, every lesson of combat doctrine, every instinct bred into men whose profession was the management of violence demanded that Kedrick allow others to clear the space first. He overruled all of it. Not because he was brave and not because he was foolish, and not because the dramatic instinct of a man raised on stories of noble confrontation demanded a face-to-face reckoning. He went alone because this was personal in a way that transcended operational categories, and he needed to look at Alistair Voss without the buffer of soldiers and hierarchy and the institutional framework that had allowed the betrayal to function for 30 years. He needed to see the man, the actual man, not the mask, not the performance, not the chamberlain who pressed his collar and aligned his ledgers and managed the machinery of trust with the precision of a master clockmaker. The chamber was large, a vaulted space that had once stored enough grain to feed the castle through a 3-month siege. The ceiling was lost in shadow. A single torch burned near the far wall, where the natural fissure opened into the rock face like a wound. The ventilation shaft exhaled cold sea air that mixed with the underground damp and created a microclimate of perpetual chill. Voss stood beside the fissure. He was dressed in his usual attire, pressed collar, dark coat, the professional uniform he had worn every day for 3 decades. His hands were empty. His posture was straight. He looked exactly like what he had always appeared to be, a competent administrator waiting patiently for instructions. The 2 remaining conspirators were gone. The passage behind Voss was open, the sealed exit to the cliff face, unsealed, just as Kedrick predicted. They had fled. Voss had stayed. That detail mattered. It mattered enormously, and Kedrick felt the significance of it settle into his understanding of this man with the weight of a final piece, completing a picture he had been assembling for days. You let them go, Kedrick said. They were children playing at conspiracy. They would have been captured on the cliff path and killed by your soldiers or the rocks. Neither outcome served any purpose. And you stayed. I have always been here, my lord. That has never changed. The words carried a strange dignity. Not defiance, not submission, but the calm self-possession of a man who understood exactly where he stood and had made peace with the geography. Voss's eyes were steady. His breathing was controlled. Whatever fear existed in him had been processed and filed away in the same meticulous system he applied to everything. 30 years, Kedrick said. The 2 words contained everything. The accusation, the bewilderment, the furious inventory of 3 decades of trust, catalogued and found counterfeit. 32. Why? Voss tilted his head slightly, considering the question the way he considered all questions, with professional thoroughness. Because your father destroyed my family's land holdings in the Western Territory to build the trade road that funds half your current treasury. Because my father worked that land for 40 years and died owning nothing. Because your family has treated the people in this duchy as inventory for 11 generations, and I decided to do something about it using the only tool available to a man without title or soldiers. Patience. Yes. And Ashworth was your instrument. Ashworth believes he is mine. That is the difference between a lord and a chamberlain. Lords think power flows from position. It flows from information. I have been the most informed man in Ashcombe for 20 years, and not one of you, not your father, not you, not Ashworth, ever considered that the man managing your paperwork might be managing your future. Cadric listened. He owed the truth that much, the disciplined attention of a man who needed to understand the architecture of his own failure before he could rebuild. Voss's motivation was not madness. It was not greed or ambition in the conventional sense. It was the cold, patient grievance of a man whose family had been destroyed by the same system Cadric inherited, and who had spent 3 decades inside that system learning how to turn its own mechanisms against it. The realization did not make it forgivable, but it made it comprehensible. And comprehension was what Cadric needed, not to excuse the betrayal, but to ensure he never built a structure this vulnerable again. The child, Cadric said. You came for the child. The child is evidence. Without it, the succession challenge has no emotional weight. Legal arguments alone do not move noble councils. Scandals do. He is not evidence. He is a person. He is a Blackthorne. You people have never been persons. You have been positions. Silence filled the chamber like water filling a hull. Cadric felt it press against his ribs, tasting of sea salt and centuries of decisions made by men who looked exactly like him and saw exactly what Voss described. Populations as resources, families as political units, children as strategic assets or liabilities measured against the cold arithmetic of dynasty. And standing in this chamber, facing the man who had spent a lifetime weaponizing the system's blindness, Cadric understood with terrible clarity that Voss was not entirely wrong. The system was broken. It had always been broken. The betrayal was monstrous, but the grievance was real, and the fact that he could hold both truths simultaneously without one. Canceling the other was itself a kind of transformation, the final collapse of the binary thinking his father had installed like prison bars around his understanding of power. Alistair Voss, Cadric said, his voice carrying a gravity that came from somewhere deeper than authority. You are stripped of all position within the Blackthorne household. Your testimony will be documented and preserved. Your actions will be answered through formal proceedings before the council, where every piece of evidence, yours and mine, will be heard in full. You could kill me here. No one would question it. I know. Your father would have. I know that too. Cadric stepped back from the man who had nearly destroyed everything. His pulse was steady. His breathing was even. The torch on the wall guttered in the draft from the fissure, throwing shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling like the ghosts of every Blackthorne who had ever stood in a dark room and chosen violence because it was easier than justice. He chose differently, not because mercy was noble, because killing Voss in a basement was the act of a man who still believed that power came from eliminating threats. And Cadric had learned, in a nursery, at a desk covered with gate logs, on a shepherd's trail in the dark, that real power came from something his father never taught him: the willingness to be changed by the truth instead of destroyed by it. Harlan's men descended to take Voss into custody. The chamberlain went without resistance, his hands extended for binding with the composed efficiency of a man completing a final administrative task. His face betrayed nothing. Whatever internal process was operating behind those careful eyes remained his alone. Cadric emerged from the lower keep into morning light that felt like a physical force against his skin. The courtyard was controlled chaos. Soldiers at every entrance, servants clustered in supervised groups, the household machinery grinding to a halt as the full scope of the breach became apparent to everyone within the walls. Edric waited by the main doors, the oilcloth bundle still clutched to his chest, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who does not know whether he has done enough to earn the right to stand where he is standing. "It's done," Cadric said. "Voss? Alive. In custody." Edric exhaled, a sound that carried weeks of accumulated terror releasing from his body like pressure escaping a sealed vessel. "And Ashworth?" "Ashworth is next, but not like this. not in basements and corridors. Cadric looked across the courtyard at the castle that bore his name. The stone walls, the towers, the banners hanging in the morning stillness. 11 generations of Blackthorns had held this fortress by being harder than the threats around them, by crushing opposition and erasing inconvenience and treating human beings as positions on a board. That was finished. "We take this to the Grand Assembly," Cadric said. "Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence Ashworth and Voss created. We present it before every noble house in Ashcombe, in open session, where denial is impossible and backroom maneuvering has nowhere to hide. The Grand Assembly hasn't been convened for a challenge hearing in 40 years. Then it is overdue." Cadric turned toward the east wing, toward the nursery, toward the woman who had held a castle with a kitchen knife, and the child whose existence had cracked the foundations of everything he thought he knew about power. He was halfway across the courtyard when a rider came through the outer gate at full gallop, the horse lathered and blowing, the rider bearing the crimson and silver standard of the Royal Council. The rider dismounted, staggered, and thrust a sealed document toward Cadric with hands that shook from exhaustion and something else. The visible terror of a man delivering a message he wished he did not carry. Cadric broke the seal. The document bore the signatures of 11 lords, a formal motion before the Great Council, a demand for the immediate removal of Duke Cadric Blackthorne on grounds of succession violation, moral corruption, and unfitness to hold authority. Filed by Lord Roland Ashworth. Seconded by the heads of houses Hargrove, Pemberton, and Caldwell. The hearing was scheduled in 72 hours, and at the bottom of the document, in handwriting that Cadric recognized with the sickening certainty of a man staring at a wound he did not know he had been carrying, was a final notation, a procedural detail so small it would have been invisible to anyone who did not understand the machinery of aristocratic law. The motion included a provision for the immediate seizure and wardship of any minor children currently under Blackthorne protection, pending the outcome of the hearing. They were coming for Rowan, and Cadric Blackthorne had 72 hours to stop them. 72 hours is not a long time. It is the distance between a Tuesday and a Friday, the span of 3 sunrises, the amount of time it takes bread dough to rise twice. But for a man whose entire world has been compressed into a single objective, protect the child, expose the conspiracy, survive the reckoning, 72 hours becomes a country with its own geography, its own weather, its own laws of physics where minutes expand and contract according to the gravity of what they contain. Cadric spent the first 12 hours in his study with Edric, Seraphine, and Harlan, dissecting Ashworth's stolen documents the way surgeons dissect anatomy, systematically, without sentiment, cataloging each piece of evidence against the specific accusation it could answer. The formal motion filed before the Great Council contained 4 charges: succession violation, moral corruption, concealment of illegitimate bloodline, unfitness to hold ducal authority. Each charge was constructed with the legal precision of a man who had spent years preparing the case, layering evidence and procedural technicalities into a structure designed to be overwhelming in its volume and devastating in its specificity. But Ashworth had built his case on a foundation that no longer existed. Every argument assumed concealment. Every piece of evidence was framed as proof that the Duke of Blackthorne had hidden the truth, suppressed the scandal, and used his authority to bury information that the council had a right to examine. The entire legal architecture depended on Cadric behaving exactly the way every duke before him would have behaved, denying, destroying, retreating behind the walls of institutional power. Seraphine's strategy inverted the equation entirely. "We don't defend," she said, standing at the desk with her hands flat on the surface, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of a woman who had been refining this approach since the night she first held a kitchen knife in a barricaded nursery. "We present. Every document Edric recovered, every letter in Voss's handwriting, every piece of the Thornfield Protocol. We walk into that assembly hall and we lay the entire conspiracy open before Ashworth has the chance to frame a single accusation. The council expects a defendant," Cadric said. "Then we give them a prosecutor." The preparation consumed every remaining hour. Edric organized the documents into chronological sequence, constructing a narrative timeline that traced Ashworth's conspiracy From its origins to the present, 3 years of covert operations, intelligence gathering, and legal manipulation rendered visible in ink and paper. Seraphine drafted the procedural framework for their counter-presentation, citing council precedents that allowed a sitting duke to introduce evidence of criminal conspiracy during any hearing that questioned his authority. The provision had been written 2 centuries ago to protect dukes from politically motivated challenges. It had never been invoked. Like the succession law Ashworth had weaponized, it sat in the legal code like a loaded weapon waiting for someone desperate enough to reach for it. Cedric himself spent the final night before the assembly alone in the nursery. He did not tell anyone he was going there. He simply found himself walking through the East Wing corridor at an hour when the castle had settled into the particular silence of deep night, when the only sounds were the distant crash of waves against the cliff base and the occasional footstep of a guard making rounds. The nursery door was unlocked. Seraphine had stopped barricading it since Voss's arrest, though the kitchen knife still occupied its position on the windowsill. A detail Cedric noticed and did not comment on, understanding that certain precautions become permanent after certain experiences. Rowan was awake, not crying, simply awake, eyes open in the dim light, making the small exploratory sounds of an infant testing the boundaries of its own existence. Cedric stood over the crib and looked down at the face that had started this entire catastrophe. Edric's jaw, Edric's brow. The Blackthorne features distributed across a canvas so small and unfinished that they looked less like heredity and more like possibility, the raw material of a person who had not yet been shaped by the forces that would define him. He reached into the crib and lifted the child. The motion was awkward. Too much hand, not enough support, the mechanical uncertainty of a man who had held weapons and documents, and the reins of power but never held something this fragile with the deliberate intention of not breaking it. Rowan weighed almost nothing. The warmth was startling, biological, immediate in a way that bypassed every intellectual framework Cedric had ever constructed, and spoke directly to something in his nervous system that did not require permission to respond. He held the child against his chest and stood at the window, looking out at the darkness where the ocean met the sky in a line so black it was visible only as the absence of stars. His father had never held him like this. Cedric knew this not from memory, but from the complete absence of memory. The empty space where a physical recollection of warmth and safety should have existed and did not. The old duke had raised his sons the way he managed his duchy, through distance and discipline and the systematic elimination of any quality that could not be converted into strategic advantage. Affection was not forbidden in the Blackthorne household. It was simply never modeled, never practiced, never demonstrated by the man whose behavior defined the boundaries of acceptable conduct. And so Cedric had grown into a man who understood power the way engineers understand bridges, as a problem of load distribution, stress tolerance, and the careful management of forces that could bring the entire structure down if improperly balanced. People were components. Relationships were structural connections. Trust was a calculated risk assessed against probability of failure. The child in his arms did not fit any of those categories. Rowan was not a component. He was not a political asset or a succession complication or a piece of evidence in a legal proceeding. He was a small, warm, breathing fact. Irreducible, non-negotiable, impossible to file under any heading in the organizational system Cedric had spent his life perfecting. And that was exactly why he mattered. Cedric held the child until dawn. Then he dressed for the Grand Assembly and rode to war. The royal citadel occupied the center of Ashcomb's capital like a stone heart pumping authority through the veins of the kingdom. The Grand Assembly Hall was its largest chamber, a vaulted space designed to hold every titled noble in the realm, with tiered galleries rising toward a ceiling painted with scenes of historical judgments that reminded everyone present of the weight their decisions were supposed to carry. Every seat was filled. The hall had not seen this kind of attendance in decades. Noble houses that normally sent representatives had dispatched their principals. The dukes and lords themselves, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a sitting duke facing formal removal proceedings. The air tasted of candle wax and ambition and the particular electricity that gathers in rooms where powerful men have come to watch one of their own fall. Ashworth occupied the prosecution bench with 3 supporting lords, Hargrove, Pemberton, and Caldwell. His expression was calibrated to project reluctant duty, the face of a man who wished he did not have to do this, but whose commitment to aristocratic principle left him no choice. His legal advocate sat beside him, a stack of prepared documents arranged with the theatrical precision of a case designed to be performed rather than argued. Kedrick entered from the main doors with Seraphine at his right and Edric at his left. The hall went quiet, not the respectful silence that greets authority, but the charged stillness that precedes collision. 200 people collectively holding their breath because the next sound would determine the direction of power in their kingdom. He walked to the defense bench and did not sit down. "Before Lord Ashworth presents his case," Kedrick said, his voice filling the chamber with the resonance of a man who has spent decades learning to make rooms listen, "I invoke Precedent 14 of the Council Charter, the right of a sitting duke to introduce evidence of criminal conspiracy during any proceedings that question his authority. This precedent has not been invoked in 212 years. The circumstances that require it have not existed in 212 years. Until now." The hall erupted, not into chaos. Noble assemblies did not descend to chaos, but into the controlled uproar of dozens of powerful men simultaneously realizing that the proceedings they had come to witness had changed shape entirely. Ashworth's expression shifted by fractions, the reluctant duty mask cracking just enough to reveal the calculation beneath it, the rapid reassessment of a man whose prepared performance had been interrupted before the curtain fully rose. "The council has not verified," Ashworth's advocate began. "The precedent does not require verification," Seraphine said. She spoke from beside Kedrick, her voice cutting through the noise with the precision of a blade designed for exactly this kind of incision. "Article 7, Section 3. The invocation is self-authorizing upon verbal declaration by the accused duke. Verification is conducted after evidence is presented, not before. Lord Ashworth's legal team is welcome to challenge the precedent's application after hearing what we have to say. I suspect they will choose not to." The room recalibrated. Kedrick saw it happen in real time. The subtle shifts in posture, the exchanged glances between noble houses, the collective recognition that the woman standing beside the Duke of Blackthorne was not a ceremonial presence. She was an operative. "Proceed," said Lord Chancellor Merrick from the adjudicator's bench. His face was unreadable, but his eyes tracked between Kedrick and Ashworth with the attention of a man who understands that the next hour will determine whether his institution survives intact. Edric stepped forward. He carried the oilcloth bundle, unwrapped now, the documents arranged in the sequence they had spent 72 hours perfecting. His hands were steady. Whatever cowardice had driven him to abandon his child and flee into the Eastern Territories had been burned out of him during weeks of isolation and the particular alchemy of desperation that sometimes transforms men from the thing they fear into the thing they need to become. "My name is Edric Blackthorne," he said. "I am the brother of the accused duke and the father of the child whose existence has been cited as grounds for these proceedings. I have testimony and documented evidence proving that this hearing is not a legitimate challenge to ducal authority. It is the final phase of a 3-year conspiracy orchestrated by Lord Roland Ashworth and executed by Alistair Voss, former chamberlain of Blackthorne Keep, to replace the sitting duke through manufactured scandal and institutional manipulation." Edric presented the evidence, letter by letter, document by document, date by date. The stolen correspondence from Ashworth's secondary estate laid bare the entire architecture. The intelligence network operated through commercial channels, the legal strategy crafted in Voss's handwriting, the systematic exploitation of household access to gather information that would be weaponized at precisely the right moment. Each document was passed to the Chancellor's bench for verification. Each one bore Ashworth's personal seal or Voss's distinctive penmanship. The hall listened. Noble assemblies were skilled at many things, but the one competency that never failed was the ability to recognize when the ground was shifting beneath the established order. Every lord in that room understood what they were hearing, not merely the details of one conspiracy against one duke, but the revelation that the machinery of aristocratic governance could be turned against any of them using the same methods. If Ashworth could plant a chamberlain inside Blackthorne Keep and spend 3 decades building a case for removal, then no household was secure, no position was permanent, no trusted servant was above suspicion. Self-interest, the force Seraphine had identified as more reliable than loyalty, moved through the assembly like a current through water, invisible but irresistible. Ashworth attempted to counter. His advocate challenged the provenance of the documents, questioned Edric's credibility, demanded proof of chain of custody. Each objection was answered with additional evidence. Cross-referenced dates, corroborating household records, Voss's own procurement logs showing the commercial channels used for intelligence transmission. The case was airtight not because it was perfectly constructed, but because the conspiracy itself had been meticulously documented by the very people who ran it. Ashworth's organizational discipline had become the instrument of his exposure. "This is fabrication," Ashworth said finally, rising from the prosecution bench with the controlled fury of a man who feels the ground dissolving beneath his position. Forged documents, coerced testimony, and the desperate theatrics of a duke who has already demonstrated his unfitness by harboring an illegitimate child under his own roof. Kedrick waited until the echo of Ashworth's voice faded from the chamber. Then he spoke. "The child is not illegitimate. As of 48 hours ago, I have executed a formal decree of legal recognition, placing the infant Rowan under full Blackthorne protection with all rights and privileges of acknowledged bloodline. This decree is filed with the Royal Registry and witnessed by the captain of my household guard, 2 sworn physicians, and the Duchess herself." The silence that followed was absolute. Not stunned silence, political silence, the kind that occurs when an assembly of powerful men simultaneously realizes that the rules have changed and they need a moment to determine which side of the new line they stand on. "You cannot," Ashworth began. "I can. I did. And any lord who wishes to challenge the right of a sitting duke to make sovereign decisions about his own household is welcome to do so. But I would suggest that every man in this room consider carefully what precedent that challenge would set. Because if the council can override a Blackthorne's household authority today, it can override yours tomorrow." The argument landed exactly where Seraphine had predicted it would, in the self-interested core of every noble present. Heads turned. Whispers circulated through the galleries with the rapid efficiency of information moving through a network of people who have just recognized a threat to their own power. Lord Hargrove withdrew his support for the motion before the morning session ended. House Pemberton followed by midday. Caldwell held until the afternoon, when the Chancellor's bench formally accepted the conspiracy evidence into the council record and announced that Lord Ashworth would face his own proceedings for criminal manipulation of judicial process. Ashworth left the Grand Assembly under guard. His face, finally stripped of every mask, carried the expression of a man who built a machine designed to destroy someone else and watched it consume him instead. He did not speak. He did not protest. He walked between 2 soldiers with the rigid posture of a man whose body has not yet accepted what his mind already knows. That the power he spent decades accumulating has just been dismantled by the same institutional mechanisms he tried to corrupt. The assembly hall emptied slowly, the way arenas empty after events that leave the audience unsure whether they witnessed a spectacle or a reckoning. Kedrick remained at the defense bench until the last noble departed, standing in the vast space with Seraphine and Edric, while the echoes settled and the candles burned low in their iron sconces. "It's over," Edric said. The words came out with the flat exhaustion of a man who has been running for months and has finally stopped. "No," Kedrick said quietly. "It's beginning." The weeks that followed moved at the speed of Reconstruction. Slower than crisis, faster than healing, measured not in dramatic confrontations but in the accumulation of small decisions that collectively reshape the landscape of a life. Ashworth's assets were seized pending trial. The commercial network he had built through Harding and Sons was dismantled. 3 additional household infiltrators were identified across 2 other noble estates, using methods adapted from Voss's operational model, confirming what the assembly had feared. The conspiracy was not isolated. It was a template. Voss stood trial before a closed session of the council. He presented his testimony with the same meticulous composure he had brought to 30 years of service, organized, thorough, and completely devoid of remorse. His account of the Blackthorne family's historical treatment of Western Territory landholders was entered into the council record, not as justification, but as context. Kedrick insisted on this over the objections of his own legal advisors. The record needed to contain the truth, All of it. Because a system that only documented its victories was a system that would repeat its failures. Voss was sentenced to permanent exile from Ashcombe. Not execution, not imprisonment. Exile. The one punishment that removed him from the system without granting him the martyrdom that execution would provide, or the continued proximity that imprisonment would allow. He left the kingdom on a gray morning, carrying nothing except the clothes he wore and the knowledge that 32 years of patient strategy had been undone by a duchess with a kitchen knife and a duke who learned to change. Edric's path was different and more difficult. Cedric did not forgive him quickly, because quick forgiveness is just another form of avoidance, a way of closing a wound before the infection has been cleaned. Instead, he assigned Edric to the Western Territories, the same land whose seizure had fueled Voss's 30-year grievance. The assignment was not punishment. It was restoration, the beginning of a process that would take years, possibly a generation, to complete. Edric would oversee the return of land rights to families whose holdings had been absorbed during the trade road construction. He would live among the people his family had displaced. He would learn what Blackthorne authority had cost from the perspective of those who paid the price. "This is not redemption," Cedric told him on the morning of his departure. They stood in the courtyard where Cedric had first returned to discover a castle, holding its breath. The air was different now, colder, cleaner, carrying the salt edge of approaching winter. Redemption is a word people use to avoid doing the actual work. This is labor. It will take years. Some of those families will hate you for being a Blackthorne. Some will never trust you regardless of what you do. That is the cost. You don't get to choose whether it's fair. Edric looked at his brother. The hollowness that had carved his face during weeks of running had begun to fill, not with the comfortable softness of a man returning to privilege, but with the angular definition of someone who was building a new structure on cleared ground. And Rowan? Rowan stays at the keep. He will grow up knowing his father. He will also grow up knowing that his father chose responsibility over comfort, and that the choice was hard, and that hard choices are the only ones that count. Edric nodded. He mounted his horse, adjusted the pack that contained everything he now owned, saying, clothes, documents, a letter from Seraphine outlining the administrative contacts he would need in the Western Territory, and rode through the gates without looking back. Cedric watched him go. The courtyard settled into the routine silence of a castle resuming normal operations, and in that silence, Cedric felt the particular weight of a man standing at the junction between the person he used to be and the person he has become. His father's portrait still hung in the East Wing corridor. Cedric walked past it that evening, pausing in the same spot where he had stopped weeks ago without understanding why. The painted eyes stared down with their frozen contempt, that expression of absolute certainty that had governed Blackthorne Keep for 31 years. "You were wrong," Cedric said to the painting. The words felt strange, not because he doubted them, but because speaking to a dead man through oil and canvas was the kind of behavior the old Cedric would have classified as weakness. About all of it. About what power requires. About what it costs. About what it's for. The portrait did not respond. Portraits never do. But saying the words aloud, giving them breath and sound and physical existence in the air between himself and his father's image, completed something that had been forming since the night he held an infant in a dark nursery and felt the empty space where warmth should have been. He was not his father. He did not need to be. The realization was not dramatic. It arrived with the quiet certainty of things that have been true for a long time before they are finally recognized, like discovering that a door you believed was locked has been open for years and you simply never tried the handle. Spring arrived at Blackthorne Keep the way spring arrives at coastal fortresses, gradually, reluctantly, as if the season itself needs convincing that the stone deserves warmth after such a long winter. The gardens along the south wall began showing color. The ocean below the cliff shifted from winter gray to the deep blue-green of warming currents. The banners on the towers caught breezes that carried the smell of new growth instead of salt and ice. Cedric found Seraphine in the garden on an afternoon when the light was golden and the wind was quiet, and the castle felt, for the first time in his memory, like a place where people lived rather than a structure where power was administered. She was sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak, Rowan in her lap, the child now old enough to grip her fingers and pull, with the determined, purposeless strength of an infant discovering that its body can act on the world. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she wore the expression of a woman who is not performing contentment but experiencing it, the face of someone who has been through something terrible and emerged on the other side not undamaged but intact. Cadric sat beside her. The bench was narrow, built for one, and sitting together required a proximity that their marriage had never practiced. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. "The council confirmed the legal recognition this morning," he said. "Full inheritance rights. Documented and sealed." "I know. The courier arrived an hour ago." "You could have told me." "You could have come to the garden sooner." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes with the same steady directness she had shown in the nursery on the first night. The same absence of submission, the same quiet authority that existed independently of his power and did not require his permission. But something else was there now, something that had accumulated over weeks of shared crisis and reluctant partnership, and the gradual, irreversible process of two people discovering that the arrangement they were given was capable of becoming something neither of them had expected. "Seraphine." "Yes." "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" He looked at Rowan. The child had discovered a leaf and was examining it with the total concentration that infants bring to objects, turning it in his small hands as if the leaf contained the complete operating manual for a world he was still learning to navigate. Any of it, the parts that aren't strategy and governance and the management of threats, the parts that involve being a person who is present in a room without calculating the political value of being there. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the oak above them, scattering light across the garden path in patterns that shifted and reformed with each gust. "You held Rowan 2 nights before the assembly," she said. "You stood at the nursery window and held him until dawn. Did you calculate the political value of that?" "No." "Then you already know how to do this. You have just never given yourself permission." The word settled into him the way rain settles into dry ground, slowly, deeply, reaching layers that had been waiting for exactly this kind of nourishment without knowing what to call it. Permission. Not the institutional kind that flows from authority and position and the hierarchical structures that organize power. The personal kind. The quiet, internal authorization to be something other than what you were built to be. Rowan dropped the leaf and reached for Cadric's hand. The grip was tiny, reflexive, carrying no intention beyond the basic biological impulse to grasp whatever was within reach. But when those small fingers closed around his thumb, Cadric felt the contact register in every part of him simultaneously, skin and bone, and the deep architecture of identity where the old walls had fallen and something new was being built in their place. He did not pull away. The three of them sat in the garden while the afternoon light moved across the stones of a castle that had survived 11 generations of men who believed that strength meant hardness and power meant distance, and the highest form of governance was the elimination of everything soft enough to be wounded. They were wrong. All of them. Every Blackthorne who had stood on these walls and looked down at the world with the cold certainty that control was the same thing as safety. Every duke who had sacrificed warmth for authority and called the exchange wisdom. Every father who had looked at his son and seen a successor rather than a child. The fortress remained. The cliffs held. The ocean continued its ancient assault on the rock below, patient and relentless and utterly indifferent to the decisions made by the men who built their lives above its reach. But inside those walls, something had changed that would outlast the stone itself. Cadric Blackthorne, the Iron Duke, the man who commanded fear and wielded silence, and built his identity on the principle that vulnerability was a door left open for enemies, sat in a garden with his wife and a child who carried his brother's face, and he let the afternoon hold them without calculating its cost. The kingdom would remember the conspiracy. The histories would record the trial, the evidence, the political upheaval that reshaped Ashcombe's power structure. Scholars would debate whether the Duke's actions represented courage or desperation, whether Seraphine's strategy was brilliance or gamble, whether the legal recognition of one small child truly justified the institutional earthquake it produced. But none of that mattered in the garden. What mattered was the weight of a child in his arms and the woman beside him, and the slow, difficult, irreversible understanding that the strongest thing a man can build is not a fortress or a legacy or a name that makes other men lower their eyes. It is the willingness to be present for the people who need him. Not as a title, not as a position, as a man who finally learned that power without tenderness is just a more sophisticated form of emptiness. The oak scattered its shadows across the path. Rowan slept against Cadric's chest. Seraphine's hand rested on his arm, a small point of contact, light as paper, heavy as everything they had survived to reach this moment. Blackthorne Keep stood on the cliffs above the ocean, the same fortress it had been for centuries. But it was no longer a monument to authority. It was a home.